Currently, the President has the power under Sections 241 and 242 of Title 18 to protect African Americans from police brutality and racial violence. And this authority is based on the power presidents received when they recovered fugitive slaves in the 1850s. My name is Dr. Joshua L. Miller, and I recently received my PhD in political science from the Catholic University of America, and I currently serve as a senior policy advisor in the United States House of Representatives. And I'm presenting this research based on a book project entitled The Politics of Race and the Development of the Law and Order President. When people think about law and order in the presidency, they sometimes think about Richard Nixon's promise to combat street-level crime, the riots of the 1960s, and even more recently the 2016 election where President Trump said that he was the law and order candidate. However, my research shows that law and order is not just a campaign slogan, nor is it just related to street-level crime, but actually is a predominant presidential power that has a history that dates back to the beginning of the American Republic. And that's the key to my research. That I argue that law and order is a presidential power that was shaped by the actions of early American presidents when they recovered fugitive slaves. This topic emerged because there is a significant gap in our presidential scholarship. Presidential scholars have debated since the 1960s on whether a president's power derives from his ability to act unilaterally through executive orders and signing statements, or whether the president's power derives from his ability to persuade Congress to enact his agenda. However, presidential scholars have not asked important questions related to the president's power to maintain law and order. And this is significant to political science and the country, because there is no greater power the president or the federal government could exercise in a free society than the power to arrest, detain, prosecute, and punish its citizens. So this research on the law and order presidency is significant not only because it represents the most expansive power a president can have, but also because it could validate or change how political scientists believe that presidential power develops generally. This research is guided by 4 specific questions. Number 1, is there an objective criteria we can use to define law and order? Number 2, what is law and order's connection to race? Number 3, when did the president obtain the power to maintain law and order? And then number 4, which executive branch institutions had the responsibility to carry out the president's law and order obligations? Using a temporal analysis and process tracing, I tracked these questions all the way to the colonial era, where I was able to answer my first question and determine objective criterion for defining law and order. That's because during the colonial era, lawmakers had developed 2 law and order systems, an episodic system and a structural system. Episodic law and order focused on punishing individuals for crimes such as homicide, theft, or rape. This is what we would associate with street-level crime. The structural law and order system, on the other hand, meant using the militia, law enforcement, and the judiciary to prevent indentured servants and then slaves from running away. Since it only applied to indentured servants and then slaves, it meant using government institutions and its criminal justice system to maintain a certain political, social, or economic hierarchy. These laws had major flaws. As slaves knew they could achieve total freedom by escaping into a free state or one of the French or Spanish colonies, the nation did not have a national structural law and order system that could facilitate the recovery of fugitive slaves that escaped outside of their state or colonial boundaries. So when it was time to form the United States under the U.S. Constitution, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention nationalized structural law and order by adding the Fugitive Slave Clause to the Constitution. Now, there are plenty of examples of early American presidents using the military and State Department to recover fugitive slaves internationally, but I will focus on one example in Spanish-controlled Florida, where fugitive slaves often escaped, married into Seminole Indian families, and became known as Black Seminoles. The first example is the Negro Fort. This was a fort that the British left to fugitive slaves and Seminole Indians at the conclusion of the War of 1812. Secretary of War William Crawford wrote to Major General Andrew Jackson and said, "The Negro Fort has been strengthened and now occupied by blacks who are well-armed, well-clothed, and disciplined. This may ultimately endanger the peace of the nation." General Jackson gave the order, and the U.S. Navy destroyed the fort using one hot shot, killing over 250 fugitive slaves immediately, took over $200,000 worth of supplies, and returned the rest of the slaves back to the United States. Now, Congress wanted presidents to do the same thing domestically, as northern states had created the nation's first sanctuary cities and made it impossible for slave owners to recover their slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, empowering the president via the U.S. Marshals to recover fugitive slaves domestically. So Presidents Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan began recovering fugitive slaves right away, like when U.S. Marshal Raleigh arrested a fugitive slave named Shadrach Minkins in Boston. A large group of free Africans broke into the courthouse and rescued Shadrach. President Fillmore quickly issued a proclamation and ordered the secretaries for the War and Navy to assist the U.S. Marshals in capturing Shadrach. However, Shadrach had eventually made it to Montreal. Now, Fillmore had several other tests to his ability to enforce the fugitive slave law, but we will move on to Anthony Burns, who was also arrested as a fugitive slave in Boston under President Pierce. When Burns was arrested, abolitionists killed a U.S. deputy marshal in an attempt to rescue him. President Pierce and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis ordered the military into Boston, and they occupied it and marched Anthony Burns through the city back to his slave owner's ship. It cost the U.S. government about $1 million when adjusted for inflation to carry out this one mission. And this is what structural law and order looked like in the antebellum era. And this was further institutionalized by James Buchanan, who delegated the slave recovery process to his Attorney General, who began to oversee the recovery operations of the U.S. Marshals. This was extraordinary because U.S. Marshals were previously viewed as agents of the judges in the states they resided, and they often shared the ideals and beliefs of their neighbors about the morality of slavery. Now the Attorney General was telling them that their chain of command for law enforcement purposes is now the Attorney General and the President. This shift in law enforcement priorities was significant, as James Buchanan could boast at the end of his term that he recovered more slaves than his predecessors, which was in his words his constitutional duty, as according to him the South would have never joined the Union in 1787 if they did not believe the federal government would recover their fugitive slaves. So this was structural law and order in the antebellum era. The Civil War begins to change structural law and order as Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation promised to use the executive government of the United States, including the military and navy, to uphold the freedom of the emancipated slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was a promise and a commitment that the executive branch would change structural law and order. Congress then passes the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which changes the definition of structural law and order from recovering fugitive slaves to protecting African American civil rights. To enforce these amendments, they had to empower the president with a new set of powers to maintain structural law and order. They did this with two very significant provisions known as the color of law and conspiracy provisions, also known as sections 241 and 242, which gave the president the power to use the marshals, the military, and U.S. attorneys to prosecute cases of police brutality and racial violence. These provisions seem like extraordinary expansion of executive power and a significant expansion of federal authority, giving the president the power to arrest state officials, police officers, and citizens for violent and discriminatory acts against African Americans. However, when Senator Trumbull introduced the law, he said that all of the enforcement provisions of this law was borrowed from the celebrated fugitive slave law. So Trumbull is saying that the power that they were given to the president to protect African American civil rights came from the authority presidents received when they recovered fugitive slaves. Most importantly, these two provisions are on the legal books today under Title 18, Sections 241 and 242, which was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, which could have been used at the discretion of the president to prosecute numerous recent cases of racial violence and police brutality. So think about that for a second. That on the legal books today, the Justice Department can prosecute a police officer for committing an act of police brutality based on the authority presidents received when they recovered fugitive slaves in the 1850s. And this is exactly what President Grant and his Attorney General did during Reconstruction. They chased down and prosecuted thousands of cases related to racial violence, police brutality, voter intimidation, and Ku Klux Klan conspiracies. In the post-Reconstruction era, presidents began to retreat from their responsibility and power to protect African Americans from lynching and police brutality, and instead expanded their authority and reorganized federal law enforcement to maintain episodic law and order. also known as street-level crime. They did this to combat the sale and distribution of alcohol and drugs, as well as prostitution. During this time period, presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt unilaterally created the FBI, and Hardin and Coolidge created, staffed, and reorganized the Bureau of Prohibition. Congress delegated the president additional powers as well. Starting in 1890, presidents could prosecute anyone using the mail to carry out lottery schemes. Prior to 1910, prostitution was legal, but it incentivized sex trafficking of European women. So Congress passed the White Slave Act, the nation's first anti-sex trafficking law. Prior to 1914, drugs were legal, and you could buy cocaine in a syringe from a Sears catalog. Now the president received the authority to combat drug distribution, and by 1919, you could be arrested by the federal government for stealing an automobile and taking it over state lines or violating the Prohibition Amendments. Presidents also directed and oversaw the prosecution of mob leaders. President Hoover oversaw the investigation and prosecution of Al Capone, which led to a 22-count indictment and an 11-year prison sentence. All while this was going on, a significant number of African Americans were being lynched across the nation, particularly in the South. Some of this violence was more egregious than others, such as the lynching of Mary Turner, who was on the left here hung right side up, but was actually hung upside down, had her baby cut out of her womb, stomped to death, and then she was burned alive. Jesse Washington, who's in the middle here, was dragged out of the courtroom, stabbed repeatedly, had his genitals cut off, and then he was burned alive. Race riots also took place in places like Springfield, Illinois, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, on Black Wall Street, where the police helped to kill hundreds of African Americans and destroy millions of dollars of property. And civil rights organizations, starting with Ida B. Wells, the NAACP, petitioned presidents for several decades to specifically use the color of law and conspiracy provisions to protect African Americans from racial violence and police brutality. They would not get a response until the Civil Rights era, specifically under Franklin Roosevelt, who expanded the president's authority over episodic law and order to combat organized crime and juvenile delinquency, and structural law and order to protect African Americans from police brutality and lynching. He unilaterally created the Civil Rights Division and tasked it with specifically protecting African Americans using the color of law and conspiracy provisions. He also directed the prosecution of numerous police officers and correctional officers, often receiving personal updates from the Justice Department. All throughout the Civil Rights era, however, you will find presidents that are willing to expand their authority to fight organized crime, use grants and rehabilitation policies to fight street-level and juvenile crime. However, they would hesitate to use the military, law enforcement, or the conspiracy or color of law provisions to protect African Americans. Harry Truman, for example, was accused of entertaining organized crime figures at the Blair House, according to this internal FBI document dated March 28, 1951. On March 29, 1951, Truman reminds the public that he is directing thousands of organized crime cases across the nation. Dwight Eisenhower likewise did the same thing. He ordered the investigation of notable real estate developers, including the father of President Trump, Fred C. Trump, for their alleged role in carrying out a scam against veterans and the Federal Housing Administration. He also, through executive orders, released their tax returns to a Senate investigative committee. John F. Kennedy was very aggressive in addressing the rise of organized crime and also focused on juvenile delinquency by implementing crime prevention and rehabilitation programs. However, Kennedy and Eisenhower did little to use the color of law and conspiracy provisions to protect African American civil rights, Little Rock, Arkansas being the exception. When Dwight Eisenhower sent the troops in to protect African American students as they integrated Little Rock Central High, he cited Title 10, Sections 332 and 333 as his authority to do so, which happened to be the same exact authority President Fillmore cited when he sent troops into Boston to recover the fugitive slaves that escaped. This next era is an interesting one, called the law and order politics era, because there was clear times during the early parts of Johnson's administration where he had to use the military, the color of law, and conspiracy provisions to protect African Americans in Selma, Alabama, and Philadelphia, Mississippi. However, I am going to focus on his efforts on episodic law and order, specifically on how law and order politics played out. The first thing you have to understand is what I mean by law and order politics. Law and order politics is generally a public debate, typically between political opponents, about the apparent or actual rise in crime and what could be done to reduce this problem. You win the law and order politics by providing symbolic and substantive solutions that gives the public confidence that you are reducing crime. Lyndon Johnson chose to play law and order politics by selling his War on Poverty initiative as a war on crime. He sold his Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 as an anti-crime initiative. After his re-election, however, Johnson made incredible strides in expanding the president's role in episodic law and order. He passed numerous laws that incentivized local and state police to prevent crime through rehabilitation, job opportunities, and education. The Safe Streets Act, in particular, created a new agency within the Justice Department, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. This agency gave state and local police one centralized federal agency to facilitate the federal government's anti-crime policies, and this helped the administration tremendously in prosecuting organized crime. However, while Johnson was signing these laws and implementing them, urban riots emerged in places like Harlem, Watts, and Detroit, all caused by some incident between the police and the black community. In the midst of this chaos, Nixon promised to use his powers as president to be tough on crime. However, Nixon's law and order policies did not differ from Johnson's or Kennedy's. In fact, he signed an extension of Kennedy's Rehabilitation Juvenile Delinquency Bill. He also signed an extension of Johnson's Prisoner Rehabilitation Act and Safe Streets Act. He then proposed and signed his own Juvenile Delinquency Act, which gave health, education, and welfare funding for juvenile delinquency programs outside of the juvenile correctional system. He also created the Office of Juvenile Delinquency within the Johnson-created Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. He also decriminalized running away and truancy, and he required states to reverse their practices of disproportionately arresting and confining minority youth offenders. This is the real difference between law and order politics and law and order policies. If you only go by the rhetoric of a president, you may actually miss their actual policies. And based on the evidence, it appears that Nixon did not have racialized crime policies. He instead had racialized law and order politics. President Carter and Ford focused on organized crime and public corruption, using the federal and state law enforcement apparatus that was expanded by Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. They did not focus too much on using the color of law and conspiracy provisions to protect African Americans. The Reagan era is very critical when looking at the law and order president because it challenges this very simple story that we have been told, specifically that the war on drugs and racism led to the mass incarceration of African Americans. In reality, for several decades, the president and the federal government had declared a war on organized crime. And in fact, Johnson and Nixon began to give local police military equipment, not to combat street-level drug crime, but to combat organized crime. By the Reagan era, the RICO statute had put organized crime on the defensive, and the media was focused less on it. But now you had a very large law enforcement bureaucracy, heavily staffed and heavily equipped for organized crime, but did not have any particular mission. The war on drugs gave them their mission, as Reagan took the crime rehabilitation programs pushed by Nixon and Johnson and used those resources or redirected those resources to incentivize local police to take on the war on drugs. However, this is not what caused the mass incarceration of African Americans alone. Mass incarceration occurred, I believe, based on the evidence, because as the government focused its attention on the war on drugs, President Reagan and the Justice Department refused to use his authority under the Sections 241 and 242, the color of law and conspiracy provision, to protect African Americans from police misconduct. On the one hand, the police had financial incentive to pursue the war on drugs in black neighborhoods, but more importantly, they knew they would not face federal prosecution for misconduct or racial violence or false imprisonment, all charges previous administrations had used against police officers. In other words, mass incarceration occurred not because Reagan was maintaining law and order by combating drugs. It happened because Reagan was not maintaining structural law and order and protecting the due process rights of African American citizens. And President Bush and Clinton neglected their responsibility as well to protect African Americans under the color of law and conspiracy provisions, with the notable exception of the Rodney King case. I do not have slides on Bush, Obama, and Trump, as that chapter is currently being worked on, but The early evidence does show that under the Bush, Obama, and Trump years, there is a shift in law and order as they merge national security and immigration with law and order, putting the Department of Homeland Security as the agency now most responsible for carrying out the president's law and order obligations in place of the Justice Department. Now, this book does have several important conclusions, starting with the fact that the presidents developed the power to maintain structural law and order because early American presidents recovered fugitive slaves. This is the connection between law and order and race. However, presidents developed the power to maintain episodic law and order, meaning street level crime, because states lacked the ability to combat crime and catch criminals that covered multiple state jurisdictions. The Justice Department is the primary executive branch institution responsible for carrying out law and order, but the Department of Homeland Security now carries this responsibility in the post-Bush era. The politics of race is the causal mechanism that causes the law and order president to develop and change. The politics of race is the conflict between those committed to racial equality and those committed to white supremacy. All throughout history, African Americans have resisted oppression, and this has been met with a violent white supremacist response, forcing presidents to expand or confine their power over law and order. Finally, this work challenges some of the premier theories in our presidential scholarship, such as the notion that a president's power is subjected to political time, according to Skowronek, or that presidents are constrained by a constitutional system of checks and balances, such as argued by Charles Jones and people who subscribe to the Richard Neustadt school of thought. These theories can only be true if you ignore the politics of race as a variable to the institutional development of the presidency. When you consider the politics of race as a variable, the president's power changes in significant ways. This is why it's essential to consider race when evaluating presidential power. And finally, I think we can develop a general theory of how presidential power develops based on how the law and order president has developed. That is, presidents either assume a power unilaterally or Congress delegates it to the president. The power is then used in a trial and error way, and then it fluctuates at times. Congress and the public develop an expectation or an acceptance of this presidential power, and then presidents institutionalize this power by delegating it to executive branch subordinates. Now, I'll say this last thing about the book project overall. I do believe that it breaks new scholarly ground because it offers a theory that has never been discussed or has never been considered because it traverses three subfields: presidential scholarship, American political development, and black politics. The concept of law and order president, structural and episodic law and order, did not exist prior to this work, and there was no definition of the politics of race or law and order politics. This work will be relevant to scholars in those respective subfields, but there is a considerable amount of information in here that general audiences will find fascinating that are central parts of telling this story of the law and order president. I have a section called When Slavery Was White that turns the notion of how we understand racism in this country upside down. I have a section called Madison's Secret War, showing that James Madison carried out a Bay of Pigs type mission to recover fugitive slaves internationally. There is epic dialogue between Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington on lynching, and pressure from Eleanor Roosevelt on Franklin Roosevelt about African Americans suffering from police brutality, and conversations between Dr. King about the KKK serving as police officers detailed to protect them in St. Augustine. Internal conversations showing that Nixon did not care about law and order and essentially seen it as a public relations issue. I mentioned Dwight Eisenhower releasing the tax returns of Donald Trump's father, but I didn't mention that the Secret Service used undercover operatives to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. Every chapter is filled with very interesting facts that is not known by the general public and is not known basically by scholars within these respective subfields. I'm hoping to have this project done by the end of 2020, and I look forward to all suggestions and feedback on this work.